She used my wife's mug before I asked her name. Lifted it from the hook by the sink like it had been waiting for her hand, rinsed it. Filled it with water to test the kettle. Then turned and smiled as if we weren't strangers in a house that had become a mausoleum of routines, if there was a line to be kept. She stepped over it with the kind of ease that makes you think the line was a suggestion, not a rule, and I didn't stop her. Because the sound of her humming threaded into rooms that had forgotten what a human voice does to air, and because I had been pretending for 2 years, ever since Nora's funeral, that I liked the quiet, that I liked the way spoons clinked without commentary in the evening news spoke to no one in particular. Her name was Lidia, she said, Lidia with 1 D, mid-40s. Hair pulled back in a practical knot that loosened as she moved, and she called me Mr. Kincaid until I told her not to. Then she called me Harold as if she'd been saying it for years. Thursdays, that was the arrangement, 2 hours of dusting and vacuuming. $30 on the counter under the paperweight shaped like a trout that Nora bought on our honeymoon in Montana, and no need to chat. But she chatted anyway, the way someone does who has learned that silence is usually a wound, not a preference. She asked about the photographs on the mantel and I told her the taller one was my daughter, June, the smaller one my son, Evan. And the black and white was me at 20 with hair I no longer believed in. She laughed and said, I like you better bald, less trouble, and I heard myself laugh back. A rusty sound that surprised me with its own existence. After the second Thursday she stayed for coffee. After the fourth she started the kettle without asking first. And after the sixth she told me the names of her boys in El Paso, Mateo and Saul. And showed me a picture of them leaning into each other like twins even though she swore they fought like wolves. When she reached for the sugar bowl, she used her left hand. And it shook a little, like a bird testing a branch. I noticed and pretended not to. I told myself I was paying for a service, nothing more. If the house felt warmer on Thursdays. If I found myself tidying the night before so she wouldn't think me a lost cause. If my eyes found the clock around noon and began to count down. Those were harmless indulgences for a widower whose world had grown too small. The first time she stayed past 5, she was chopping onions in my kitchen, sleeves pushed up. Hair pinned with a yellow clip that looked like it belonged to a girl. Not a mother of grown sons, and the smell of onions in olive oil did something to my nerves. Nora never had to do anything to, because she was the one who used to stir the pot. Tap the wooden spoon twice against the rim, and tell me to stop hovering. Lydia didn't tell me to stop hovering, she said. Sit there and tell me your favorite place in Florida. As if she were braiding a rope between us from ordinary questions. The pier at Gulfport, I said, finally. Because saying Nora's side of the bed would have been a cruelty. And Lydia nodded like I'd given the right answer. Then set a plate of something bright and red in front of me and said, eat. When she carried the laundry basket up the stairs after dinner, I followed without thinking. A dog trailing a whistle, and she paused in the hall outside the bedroom as if assessing a blueprint only she could see, instead of turning left to the guest room. She turned right into mine and set the basket on the bed. You don't fold like this, she said, taking one of my shirts and creasing it with decisive hands. You do it like this so the drawer doesn't look like a storm hit it. I could have said, leave it, or, that's not your place, or, I'm not ready. But all those sentences stuck behind my teeth because she had already moved on to the socks. And watching someone who is not your wife touch your socks with that level of attention is Either the saddest thing in the world or the most intimate, depending on the day. After that, Thursdays became Thursdays and some Fridays. A Saturday morning appeared like a stray dog on the porch, unannounced. And she told me she'd been in the neighborhood and thought the azaleas needed trimming. A toothbrush materialized in the cup by the sink, pink, then white. Then green when she decided mine shed bristles, and it did not feel foreign after the second week, which scared me more than if it had. She began answering the doorbell when I didn't rise fast enough, waving to neighbors with an ease that made them wave back before their faces arranged themselves into polite curiosity. I was a known quantity here. A retired pressman who walked slow and raked leaves in straight lines. And now there was a woman watering my lawn, moving my furniture an inch to the left, laughing at a volume that woke up the dog 3 houses down. "House looks alive, Mr. Patel said over the hedge, and I nodded like I'd done something to deserve the compliment. June called on a Monday and asked, "Who is the lady watering your porch ferns?" With a voice that wore a smile over something that wasn't smiling, and I said, "Lydia." As if the name explained everything, and June said, "Is she a nurse?" And I said, "She helps me keep the place up." Which was true if we defined place as every room and every hour and every bit of air between them. "Be careful, Dad," she said, softer, and I wanted to ask what that meant. Careful of whom, careful of what, but my throat had gone tight and I mumbled, "I'm fine." The way people who are not fine always do. Lydia began leaving things where they wanted to be left. A sweater on the back of the dining chair. A half-read paperback tilted face down on the arm of the couch. A pair of sandals under the bench by the door. She stayed one stormy night because the causeway flooded and she refused my keys because she said she never learned to drive, which I did not believe but did not challenge. And she slept in the guest room with one arm flung over her eyes like someone trying to block a memory. At 3 in the morning, when thunder walked across the roof, she appeared at my bedroom door silhouette black and asked, "Do you ever hear her?" And I thought she meant the storm, but she meant Nora, and I said, "At the sink, sometimes. When the water first warms up," and Lydia nodded and retreated as if that answer had proven a theorem she already knew to be true. In the morning she made chilaquiles. Chipped tortillas softened with salsa and fried eggs sliding in the pan. And when I took the first bite the heat made my eyes water and she laughed at me. Then leaned across and thumbed a smear of red from the corner of my mouth and didn't move her hand right away. The hand was warm. The line was elastic. The weeks did what weeks do, stacked themselves until you cannot see where one ends and another begins. I became the kind of man who bought fresh limes without a recipe in mind. She became the kind of woman who put my Tylenol in a small glass dish by the lamp. Neither of us wrote down what we were doing. I did not tell June that on a Wednesday I woke with Lydia's hair on my wrist like a black river, or that when she laughed at a movie that wasn't funny I laughed too because the sound had become its own reason. I did not tell Evan anything at all. He lives in Seattle where rain is a second language and men reinvent themselves every 12 years. If there is a moment when you know the house is no longer yours alone, it is not a violin swell moment, it is mundane and humiliating. It is the morning you open your closet and realize the hangers have been sorted by color and you do not live with ghosts who care about such things. "Looks better," Lydia said from the doorway, unashamed. "Looks like someone lives here who expects to keep living." I asked, because I had to, "What do you expect?" And she looked past me to the window and said, "To see the Gulf from your pier one day." And when I didn't answer fast enough, she turned back and added, to not feel like luggage. As if the story of her life had been dragging itself through airports. Always someone's temporary responsibility. I wanted to say, you're not luggage, you're the person who reminds me how to breathe. But I said, we'll go to Gulfport on Saturday, and she said, we'll see. The past does not sit quietly when you bring in new furniture. One afternoon I was pulling down the old banker's boxes Nora labeled in her thin precise hand, taxes '09, Evans report cards. Recipes to try, and a fourth box tumbled from the closet shelf and split. Spilling letters tied in a red ribbon that had lost its red. And on top was an envelope addressed to L. Paredes in a script that should not have been familiar and was, Norris. My hands went numb. I sat on the floor among the paper like a man in the aftermath of confetti. And I opened the first letter. Querida Lidia, it began. And I had to set it down because the room went small. Nora had written her. Not once but many times, neatly dated in the last months when cancer turned days into algebra. I read enough to cut myself wide open. He doesn't know how to ask for help. I will leave something for you with June. She will fight me, but I will win. He will pretend he is fine, but he is not. Stay until he stops pretending the house is all he needs. Stay until it is your house too. If you want it to be. My breath went feral. I did not hear Lidia come in until she knelt beside me. Her hand hovering over the paper without touching it, and said. The words soft but ironed flat by practice. She asked me before she died. I told her no at first. Then I told her I would help you after the funeral. Only to make sure you ate. It was supposed to be 3 weeks. 3 weeks, I repeated, because echoing the last thing a person says is easier than thinking, and she looked at me then, really looked, and added. I didn't know I would like your house. I didn't know I would like you. I felt both betrayed and blessed, a ridiculous combination. The woman I'd loved had orchestrated my rescue. And the woman I had begun to need had not been a random kindness but a plan. June knows? I asked, and in that instant my daughter walked into the doorway with her own key in her hand. And a storm on her face. June knows, she said, not smiling. And the letters were all over the floor like evidence in a courtroom. And for a minute no one moved. We did the confrontation quickly because there are only 2 ways to do such things, slowly, which is cruel, or quickly, which is clumsy. June told me Nora had hired Lidia for a few hours a week months before she died. Then made a small fund in cash she'd tucked into an envelope labeled, housekeeping, long term. That June had refused to deliver because the idea of replacing her mother with anyone felt obscene. She made me promise, June said. I hated it. I thought you would hate me. I thought you would hate her. She jerked her chin toward Lidia and added. And then I saw you standing on the porch with your newspaper pretending to read it and I did what Mom asked. I let Lidia in. If there is a twist here that doesn't fit the melodrama, it is this: I did not rage, and June did not weep. And Lidia did not apologize for using Nora's mug. We stood inside a choice the dead had made for us and realized we had been living inside it for months. The second twist came a week later. When a man in a shirt that fit him too well knocked on the door and said he was from the county and needed to discuss something Lidia had not told us. Her visa had died a quiet death 2 years earlier. And she had been living in a state of perpetual almost. They won't take me, Lidia said afterward with the kind of certainty that makes you realize certainty is a brave performance. They might, June said, cruel only because truth often is. They might, I echoed, and the toothbrush in the cup suddenly looked like contraband. We did what families do when a threat puts its teeth on the edge of the table. We moved closer. June found a lawyer who charged too much and smiled too little. Evan called more often and asked ridiculous practical questions about documents as if he weren't 3 time zones away. Lidia slept less and cleaned more when she is anxious. So the house shone in a way that made the neighbors gossip about how happy I must be. And I thought about Nora writing letters to a woman she had met twice and asking her to stay until he stops pretending, and I felt the wild, grateful anger that only love leaves in its wake. This was never about cleaning, I said to Lidia late one night when the Gulf air came through the screen like an old song, and she said, no, and then, after a long pause that held every mistake either of us had ever made, but I did clean the parts you wouldn't touch. On a Saturday I took Lidia to Gulfport like I had promised in that Hotel Bright kitchen months before. We walked the pier. Pelicans watched us like bored politicians. She bought a paper cone of shrimp and I licked Old Bay from my thumb and told her about the first time Nora took me there, how we danced to a cover band playing Van Morrison under string lights while flies buzzed around the beer. You can miss her and still want me to stay, Lidia said, not as a question but as permission. And I nodded, then shook my head. Then nodded again because the answer was yes and no in equal measures. When we got home there was a letter from the lawyer in the mailbox that made Lidia sit down in the middle of the living room because her knees forgot how to be knees. The application had been accepted for review, not a victory but not a loss. A small place to stand. We wait, she said, as if waiting were an action instead of an ache. Weeks folded, then months. The neighbors learned to wave first. Mr. Patel brought over mangoes that tasted like late summer and told me the house looked good. June stopped using the voice she saved for complicated topics and began to ask Lidia for recipes. Evan came home for Thanksgiving and found his mother in the way Lidia labeled the spice jars. We planned small things, a new rug, a trip to the farmer's market, teaching me to make salsa that didn't taste like regret. On a Tuesday morning in early December the county sent a notice that made no promises but offered a path, and the path led through a room with hard chairs and a judge who looked younger than my shoes, and when he asked if we had anything to add I said, she entered my house to clean and stayed to make it a home. And I didn't care if it sounded sentimental because truth often is. He stamped something that mattered and didn't smile but didn't frown. And outside the building Lidia's hands shook like birds finally allowed to land. That night I set 2 mugs on the counter and reached for the hook with Nora's mug. Then stopped and reached for the sturdy blue one we'd bought at the market last month. And I handed it to Lidia and she said, we will keep hers for guests, and I said, yes. And the word did not feel like betrayal. It felt like a door easing open without a squeak for the first time in years. On the mantel between the photographs of my children there is a new one now. Lidia squinting at the sun on the pier, hair blown feral by the wind. Mouth open in a laugh you can almost hear. People who come to the house notice and say, you look happy. And I have learned to say, I am, without apology. If you want a moral, there isn't one neat enough to frame. I tried to hire silence and got a life instead. I told myself I could manage grief by polishing surfaces and learned it is a beast that sleeps on the cleanest floors. My wife loved me enough to plan for my stubbornness. My daughter loved me enough to honor a request she despised. A woman with a shaking left hand loved me enough to use my wife's mug without asking and then stay to fight the storm that came for her. At the end of the night, when the lights are off and the house does what houses do, settles, sighs, remembers, I stand in the hallway where our two toothbrushes lean into each other in the cup like a small, domestic cathedral. And I do not ask the old questions about what belongs to whom. I turn off the kettle. I check the lock twice. I listen to breathing in the next room that says the quiet has been replaced by something messier and better. She entered to clean. She stayed to stay. And I, who once thought myself good at being alone, have finally learned how to live with a door that opens and does not close.